during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn the event over to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today, we'd like to take a little time to stand back and consider Ukraine since independence in 1991. Ukraine captured world attention with the dramatic 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2014 Maidan Revolt, which ousted President Viktor Yanukovych. But lasting political and economic results have remained elusive for Ukraine. The Heritage Foundation ranks it last in economic freedom among 45 countries in Europe, and Freedom House recently scored Ukraine as only partially free. In between the EU and Russia, the country searches for answers to the question of who are we? To help us answer these questions about Ukraine and get a better understanding of it, today's guest is Dr. Nicolai Petro, professor of politics at University of Rhode Island. During the administration of President George H.W. Bush, he served as special assistant for policy in the Office of Soviet Union Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and as a temporary political attaché at U.S. Embassy Moscow. He's earned 2 Fulbright Awards, one to Russia in the 1990s and the other to Ukraine from 2013 to 2014. He has been a fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and had research awards with the Kennan Institute and the Hoover Institution. Among his frequent publications include 3 books on Russian democracy and foreign policy, and he's currently finishing another book on Ukraine. He earned his PhD in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Nick Petro.
Nice to be here. So I'll just get started. Sharing the screen. I have a 5-minute presentation and 3 slides, and then we'll just move on to Q&A and discussion after that. So, whoops, there, okay. So this book that I am currently finishing is an attempt to anchor political analysis within the realist political philosophy by showing how classical Greek tragedy can provide insights and solutions to seemingly insoluble political problems. My example is Ukraine, where internecine conflict, which the Greeks would have immediately recognized as leading to a tragic cycle, has persisted for decades, if not centuries. I chose Ukraine because, in addition to having studied both Russia and Ukraine all of my adult life, in 2013 to 2014, a fateful year, my family and I lived there and witnessed firsthand as history unfolded and the country unraveled. That year, I gave over 200 media interviews, but still felt I didn't have a good explanation for what I was witnessing. Many analysts saw the crisis as the result of Russian aggression, even suggesting that there were no rifts in Ukrainian society before 2014, even though such divisions had been until then a central theme of Ukrainian studies. I finally found my answer in Professor Richard Ned Liebau's book, The Tragic Vision of Politics. It fit what I was seeing: the rise of nationalism and revolutionary zealotry, the demonization of the domestic opposition, and the resulting explosion of social conflict. The more I dug into the politics of tragedy and of Ukrainian history, the more I saw current events as part of a pattern that has been repeating itself for at least 150 years. Along the way, I learned that the decline of nations is foreshadowed in their domestic political discourse, that hubris and loss of compassion are common signs that the tragic cycle is reaching its apogee, This is all, however, that modern political science has learned from tragedy, a rather depressing conclusion. But this is not the conclusion of the Greeks. And here we come to the healing part of this talk. They believed that tragic plays were an opportunity to instruct and to heal society. By identifying the elements that feed the tragic cycle and applying timely countermeasures, they believed that lost social harmony could be restored. These countermeasures were anagnorisis, making the public aware that the restoration of social harmony requires the common efforts of the whole community. Catharsis, purging one's soul of hatred so that confrontation can give way to honest dialogue. And dialogue, which begins when participants begin to grasp how their own actions have led to anger, and instead of choosing confrontation, choose to rebuild the relationship. These ultimately lead to the possibility of true justice, which is compassion rather than the vengeance that many people mistakenly call justice. And finally, to social harmony, which is secured when former enemies become stakeholders in the social order. Breaking Ukraine's tragic cycle will therefore require shifting attention from the superpower conflict over Ukraine to the conflict within Ukraine, between its two regional identities, one looking west, the other looking east. Resolving the conflict over Ukraine will not resolve the conflict within, whereas by resolving the conflict within Ukraine, we will also be resolving the conflict over Ukraine by restoring agency to the Ukrainian people. That's my spiel. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Sorry, wanted to save that for later.
Can you show all your slides?
Oh,
We had, there was a few slides there that
sure.
we saw yet.
Well, here's the, I'll go back into the, oh, sorry. Huh, forgot. Let me do the share screen again.
That's fine.
A few words about the slides then.
Right. Yeah. Just I thought we'd
This one.
talk a little bit about some of the polling too.
So here's just a random gathering of data from I should say maps showing.
We don't see it yet, though, Nick.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Okay, hold on. Huh, you're right. Okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah. Go. Yeah, that's right.
All right. How's that?
Okay. And if you hit the slide show there, hit that. If I don't think it came up because.
Can you see it now?
I see the voting pattern slide.
That's right.
Oh,
you
we
want to
also
see them all
see
together?
the notes on the left. Yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
Why don't we try to go with that?
So, yeah, here we are. How's that? Make it
Okay,
let's
take a look at that one, those slides.
So here's the, obviously can't get down into the nitty gritty, but if you Google voting by regions in Ukraine, you see this pattern repeat itself over and over. Not just, well, obviously we've had regional patterns the last 30 years, and you see it, you see the right, or rather, left bank Ukraine in having a different pattern from right bank Ukraine. And why do they call it right bank and left bank? Because the way the Dnieper river flows from north to south, as you go along the bank, on the left is the largely Russian-speaking portion, on the right is the largely Ukrainian-speaking portion. And these patterns just seem fixed, or rather quite resilient, let's put it that way. So the second slide, I have tried to give you a sense, at least, of the intensity of the perceptions that not all people have, of course, but certainly some people have, and that arouses rather stark emotions. This is one of many photos that you can find of the Azov battalion, the famous Azov battalion, volunteer units that have been at the front lines of the combat in the eastern half of Ukraine. One of many photos that you can find online that, again, portray them as fanatics, definitely, and with emblems that many of us would find troubling. And this is how, indeed, a lot of Eastern Ukrainians see the predilections of Western Ukrainians historically, and they fear that history being imposed on them. And on the right, you see Tyzhyn, a well-respected Ukrainian weekly from, I think this is 2020, the cover. And here you have the bestiary of revenge. And you have some noted opposition political figures. In the middle, you have Kuchma, President Kuchma's former chief of staff, and the head of the leading opposition party today, the opposition bloc. On the far right, you have his co-chair. Here you have on the far left two members of parliament from the president's party. Here, directly on Medvedchuk's right, is Anatoly Shary, Ukraine's most popular blogger, but in exile, because he was exiled still under the previous president. On the right, you have Portnov, a famous deputy chief of staff, as well as a lawyer, and the head of the Kievan Pecherska Lavra, a religious leader of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. So these are all demons trying to reestablish the old order from the perspective of this noted journal, newspaper, a weekly journal. And here you have just the five things I mentioned, Athena, and the presumed cover of my book coming up.
Okay.
Oh, and here's something I thought might be interesting to come up with. When we talk about Russophone Ukraine, sometimes I call them the other Ukrainians. It's pointed out, it has been pointed out to me and to others, that Russophone Ukrainians are not necessarily pro-Russian. That's absolutely true. That this is not a strict linguistic divide. But what is important to think about is not to make it about language, but to make it about cultural orientation. And a good way to think of it might be Russophile rather than Russophone. In other words, how many people actually think of themselves or associate their Ukrainian identity and feel comfortable combining that with their Russian identity? They don't want to choose between the two. They want to see both as complementary. And there's lots of different ways to describe what Russophile might be. But one convenient way is to ask the question of Ukrainians that Putin, phrase it the way that Putin did in July of 2021. And the question posed by the rating agency in Kiev was, recently, Russian President Putin said Russians and Ukrainians are one people who belong to one historical and spiritual space. Do you agree? And their survey of 2,500 residents, of course, omitting Crimea and the occupied territories of Donbass, came up with these results by region. And the sum total they found was 41% said that they agreed, 4% were undecided or uncertain, and 55% said they disagreed. You can read that a lot of different ways, but I would say that it is significant in our analysis when thinking about the divisions within Ukraine that need to be healed. Here's a good example of that. 41% are comfortable with the idea of Russia and Ukrainians being one people, not necessarily one nation, but cognate peoples. And that's a high number, and I would consider that actually a Russophile. I'd say that's the core of the Russophile population of Ukraine.
Mhm.
So I'm going to stop sharing this now, I guess. Is that all right?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that context. Yeah, important context there on what people are thinking from a poll from last year. And one question now, I think, leading from some of your intro statement, nationalism, of course, we're hearing that a lot with respect to Ukraine, but there are different versions of this. How would you categorize the different narratives, nationalist narratives in Ukraine right now?
That's a very big topic, and there are books written about nationalism.
Mhm.
Let me say that I approach the topic looking at the larger literature on nationalism, and I was very impressed with the arguments of an Italian scholar, Maurizio Viroli. And Viroli draws a distinction, as well as Mary Dietz. But both of them draw a net distinction between patriotism and nationalism. And this follows the way that Hans Morgenthau and scholars immediately after World War II tended to view nationalism, which was very unsympathetically. They tended to argue that nationalism was a form of totalitarianism. It focused all attention on the construction of a nation state for a particular constituency, and it demanded, the construction of this nation state demanded the subordination of everyone to that ethno-national identity. And this was problematic in the modern world. Since then, nationalist studies have evolved. And there are a lot of people like Stephen Walt at Harvard and a number of others, even Anne Applebaum, for example, who argue that nationalism can be a good thing. And they skip over the nationalism of the 1930s to the early nationalism, the earliest forms of nationalism that were romantic nationalism of the late 19th century, and say, couldn't we revive that aspect? And Viroli says, when you do that, it's not nationalism. That's patriotism. And patriotism has its own history that began to diverge from nationalism right around that time. And Viroli, and I agree with him, argues that it's silly to argue that these passionate feelings for home and hearth are not important. They are. They're tremendously important. And they need to be harnessed to the civic good. And that's exactly what a republic does. And that's exactly what a Republican patriotism does. And he goes through tons of evidence for this, and then argues that's what needs to be reconstituted today. But at the same time, in order not to poison the well, we need to sharply distinguish between that form of patriotism, which is a local patriotism, distinguish that from an ideological nationalism, which is overwhelmingly, has been, and continues to be around the world, imposed by national governments, indeed, not national governments, but even factions of national governments, in order to establish basically some form of authoritarian rule. That is the true history of nationalism even today. I would agree with that statement, but I am a supporter of patriotism and hostile, I would say, to nationalism, given its history and pedigree.
So having a single official language, perhaps,
Well,
is that, I mean,
what I think would help Ukraine would be a civic form of identity, replacing ethno-nationalist identity and an emphasis on unity through the construction of a very sharply defined and narrow Ukrainian national identity centered around Galician Ukraine, the history of Galicia, and trying to expand that over the entire territory, I think tends to be something that leads to divisions, whereas the solution is not the opposite. It's not to expand the Russophile identity westward. It is to strive for both regions to establish a common core civic identity and to reduce the importance of nationalism, ethnicity, religion. You know, these sorts of splits go on not only nationwide, they go on in families. You know, if we want to hold families together, we emphasize compassion, love, charity, not why are you speaking, you know, this way or that way.
so maybe, so this kind of leads into, all right, so what's the political formula for this? Is it revising the idea of federalism again?
It could be, but it need not be. I understand perfectly well, as everyone does, who watches, has studied Ukraine, that federalism was widely discussed in the 19th century by the founding fathers of Ukrainian nationalism, of the Ukrainian nation, I should say. It was again widely touted by Vyacheslav Chernovil in the 1990s, the leader of the Ruch movement. However, for a variety of reasons, today, federalism is taboo. If you mention it, you are automatically labeled as being beyond the pale and as favoring separatism, because the fear in Western Ukraine is that if you do allow that degree of regionalism throughout the country, then the East will separate. That's the de facto, although that in fact is, I think, is a greatly exaggerated fear, and wasn't the case when there was at least the ability for local governments after 2012 to have local language usage be in Russian. And as you know, half the regions of the country immediately adopted that, Russian as a second language. But that was not acceptable as a premise for constituents in Western Ukraine. So federalism is off the table as a term, but the idea, there's no one formula for federalism. Federalism is nothing more than whatever the central government and the regions negotiate. That's all federalism is everywhere. And exactly what they negotiate is up to those two parties. But the premise has to be, there's us, there's the center, and there's the regions, and one does not get its authority wholly from the center. The regions don't. The regions have something that stands independently or autonomously from the center. So the former president, Petro Poroshenko, spoke of this formula as a deep decentralization. And he said, we don't need federalism because we'll do much of that in the form of deep decentralization. And that's certainly possible. Again, the devil is in the details. What does that mean? To some extent, I would say many political groups in Ukraine, constituencies, do favor decentralization because, well, it just makes sense. It makes government administration that much easier. However, devolution of power endangers other interests, particularly those that allow power and financial resources to be accumulated in the center. So this will be, there's no easy solution. It's a long-term process. And even if that process were begun, it would be a never-ending process. And just like our federalism hasn't ended, it continues to evolve, it continues to be refined. And whatever solution Ukrainians find, it's one they have to decide upon for themselves.
Do you see the leadership there in the current group of Ukrainian leaders, somebody who could rally the country around a sort of a new civic form of identity?
To some extent, I would say if the country is to hold together and heal, that will have to be the case. That is the solution. The solution, there's two schools of thought, apparently, about how to achieve that unity, that social unity. One says you eradicate the Russian contamination of Ukraine, which is not recent. It's been going on for a long time. And we just have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually we will perform this cleansing. And as a result of that cleansing, we will then be able to construct the true Ukraine. I think that's the nationalist message. The other view is Ukraine is what it is today. And that eradication is dangerous. Most people don't want to do it and will fail. Therefore, you need to talk to the Ukrainians who are in Ukraine today, which are very diverse, and accept that diversity. The latter path requires dialogue, and it requires the recognition that the other needs to be part of us. The other Ukrainians, we need to accept them. They're not fake Ukrainians. They're not people who have lost their identity. They need to be accepted as part of the Ukrainian nation, wholeheartedly as part of the Ukrainian nation. The former method of eradicating, I can't say it won't work, but it's hard to think of positive examples in history where that has turned out well. That's about all I can say.
Right. Well, we have a lot of good questions, and I think that we'll start getting to them now. And thanks for everybody for posting those. You can post them in the Q&A, you can post them in the chat, and we will get to all of them. And we obviously a lot of people here want to figure out what's going on. It's very confusing. Analysis is very all over the place, as we were mentioning before we started. So let's. I'm going to start with a couple here. What position does the Ukrainian Orthodox Church occupy in the political process and Ukrainian strategic culture? how does this connect or disconnect with the Russian Orthodox Church and its supposed position within the Putin inner circle?
So, I wrote an article for Yale International Review. All my articles are available on my website and petro.net. You can find that one there. It was about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So, historically, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been part of the Russian Orthodox Church in the early 1990s. I believe it set itself up as an autonomous church, but it nevertheless has close ties to the Russian Orthodox Church and to all the canonical churches of Eastern Orthodoxy. Along with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, there have existed two other churches. One is the Autonomous Church, and the other is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate. It's a very intricate story, but essentially one of the leading hierarchs of the Moscow Church decided to declare himself the head of an independent Ukrainian church, and that became the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate. Skip forward to the present. In 2018, the government of Ukraine became involved and assisted in the consolidation of the Autonomous Church and the Kievan Patriarchate Church. Now they are the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And they have a different legitimacy, strand of legitimacy derived from the Patriarch of Constantinople, who has granted them a tomos, a document affirming this as the proper Orthodox Church in Ukraine. All of this has been accompanied by legislation that was passed to decertify, now by law, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. However, that law renaming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as or into the Russian Orthodox Church of Ukraine its implementation has been suspended because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church argues that it's illegal. It's been separate from Moscow administratively, and certainly not spiritually, but administratively for 3 decades. And it just finds that whole argument offensive. And that's basically where we are. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine generally takes positions that are pro-government. The position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and I'll keep adding the 2 letters Moscow Patriarchate, MP, just to clarify who we're talking about, argues that its hierarchs argue this is a fight among brothers. There are brothers in Ukraine who are fighting each other, and we need to stop this internal conflict. They do define it not as an aggression, but as an internal conflict. They also highlight that the only institution currently in Ukraine that unites all the territories of Ukraine, Crimea, and the rebel areas in Donbass, is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. They are the only ones that have parishes over this entire territory. And so they want to be part of the solution and the healing. And they argue that the way to do this is to pray for peace and to organize. They have been active through seminars in organizing people-to-people meetings, sort of person-to-person contacts, not just between clergy, but certainly among social groups and constituencies on both sides of dividing line in the East, so that to build that kind of dialogue. So that's the official position. They are, however, not very welcome in the halls of power in Kiev. That's about all that I can add to that.
Thanks. Let's get to a few more questions. Elijah asks, do you think Ukrainians will be receptive to the implementation of civic identity to achieve social unity? It will take a significant sacrifice for those on both sides of the Dnieper. Eradication of Russian influence seems like it would likely spur more animosity than unity.
Yeah. There's, I think, no reason to eradicate one's core identity in order to establish a civic identity. A civic identity can be inclusive of your religious, cultural, etc. identity. The United States might be an example. I don't have to prove my Americanness by not speaking Russian, or by not speaking Spanish, or by going to a Protestant church. I mean, ostensibly, we could argue, it could be argued, you know, we certainly were at one point a waspish culture. But the fact that we are less so now, or we don't stipulate those criteria, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, white, as mandatory criteria for joining the political discussion or for being good citizens. And there's no reason that one should have to. But one shouldn't, the danger is doing the opposite. In other words, saying you can't be a citizen unless you're Protestant, right, or unless you're a member of this church or speak that language. That's the danger. Right. The opposite is typically not the case and not a danger.
It took us a little time in the U.S.
Yeah.
You know, it took us a little.
Still a work in progress.
It's still taking us a little time, but yeah.
Still a work in progress. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Leo. I would love to know your opinion on the probability of an armed conflict between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine.
I think it's very, along with most Ukrainian analysts and the political and military elite in Ukraine, it's very low, judging from what they say. You know, we've had statements pretty much daily now from the Minister of Defense, from the head of the National Security and Defense Council. The president's gone on television, President Zelensky's gone on television twice, saying people should not be worried. In fact, there is no unusual concentration of resources aimed at permitting an invasion across the border. There is certainly, the Ukrainian government asserts, a threat by Russia, but it's not a new threat, it is the continued threat. And one of the dangers or the problems that I see with the current American rhetoric on this issue is that it destabilizes the situation in Ukraine. And the president has, in fact, indicated, President Zelensky has indicated that he wishes the rhetoric would calm down in the West, because it is leading to investors fleeing. The national currency has lost nearly 10% in a month of its value. Gasoline prices are skyrocketing, and it's just making people nervous. And he can't. There's a limited shelf life to going on television and saying, "Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry," to the people. It's going to lose its effectiveness. So I could speculate about what I think is actually going on, why this rhetoric is there. In a nutshell, I don't think. I think the United States has a bigger agenda than just Ukraine. Its agenda is actually about NATO, preserving NATO, and this is the position that it's taking is actually to keep our NATO allies in line, make sure to rebut Russian efforts to constrain or redefine NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and potentially throughout the former Soviet area. And that's a much more important and bigger issue to the United States than Ukraine is or ever will be.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And Jordan, if you're still out there, I believe that was a very similar question and that Professor Petro answered that for you. Please post something else in the chat if you wanted to elaborate on that. Chloe asks, do you think we will see revanchist Russian tactics exercised elsewhere, say in the Baltic states?
I wish you could be more specific as to what those tactics were. Russia has had a position always in its strategic documents that it supports the rights of Russian speakers everywhere in the world, but most specifically of those that, as Putin put it, in 1990 or in 2007, in his famous Munich speech, those who have been orphaned by the collapse of the USSR, and Russia feels it has an obligation to them. That obligation is not unusual in the world. If you believe that there are nefarious designs behind it, well, then it can be used for all sorts of things. Or you can be used like, the British Council, supporting the English language, or USIA. Hey, let's help people come to the US and study English, or the Confucian Institute, which, by the way, we now have problems with, in the United States. So if you see more there as part of an effort to detach those regions, that would clearly be disruptive and bad. But I don't see that as the goal. I don't see that. That's nowhere in Russia's public national security statements or foreign policy doctrine.
All right, thanks. Sheila, I've got a question. You gave a long post here. I'm going to try to I'm trying to get this down to the nutshell, as you put it. In order to affect a diverse but homogeneous culture where peace can prevail in Ukraine, what do you propose? What can NGOs do to strengthen the society and peace generally? And can the US assist in this process?
In my book, at the end, I specifically look at all of the proposals that I've come across, and there are well over 100. What to do, how to restore tranquility and social healing. Now, there are ones that they focus on two different paths. One is essentially, we know the solution. It's a solution that involves external constraints of some sort, imposing, but also carrot and stick, things that we can do for Ukraine, to Russia, to get them to back off of Ukraine. that these are all external forms of assistance, and they don't see a problem inside, really. Whatever problems there are, the solution from this first line of thinking is it'll all be solved by economics. In other words, once the economy takes off, everybody's making money. Who cares what language they're speaking? The language will be money. The second approach, however, is one that specifically focuses on healing the domestic divide. And there are a lot of those. And one of the most interesting that I have looked at a lot are the initiatives and the proposals by Zelensky's confidant, who for a brief few months was invited as a consultant to join the National Security and Defense Council, Sergei Sivocha. And Sivocha had a whole slew of initiatives, and he continues to work in his own way even after he was fired, to essentially argue that the people in Donbass have issues, and their concerns about rejoining Ukraine need to be addressed, or we won't get them to rejoin Ukraine. Meanwhile, we in Ukraine have to be willing to listen to their issues and not blame them for everything, and basically accuse them off the bat of disloyalty in that way. So his solution, and there's some very interesting ones, but they follow patterns taken in Northern Ireland, Colombia, and a couple of other places. He hasn't used this term, but it's one that I want to talk about a lot in my book. It's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. There are, in fact, 34 countries that have undergone this kind of truth and reconciliation process. And they're all over the map. Sometimes this process begins during the negotiations, before the conflict even ends. Sometimes it takes place after the conflict ends. Sometimes it includes power sharing arrangements. Sometimes it doesn't. In other words, there's lots of different examples that could be with profit applied to Ukraine. So taking Sivocha's assumption as the correct one, that there needs to be a dialogue between the rebel populations and the larger Ukrainian population, and trying to institutionalize that dialogue in something that we've done in different countries, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, a big part of which is people just being able to tell their story. This is why I did this. I felt threatened. I did this, or I regret doing this, and I'm sorry, and all these things. That would be very helpful, because right now, when you look at the Ukrainian media, the sides are not talking to each other, and efforts to get them to talk to each other have been shut down very quickly, and that's not a path to healing.
Two more questions here. Yeah, I got it. I've got a obstreperous puppy in the background here. I'm trying to. What role can the U.S. play in assisting Ukraine against reported Russian aggression? Should such aggression continue to persist or possibly increase?
Well, I think the key issue is purported and sort of yet to be done. We have a problem in international affairs and international law, and that's sovereignty. So if I want to move 1 million troops anywhere in my country, I could do that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing illegal with that. There's nothing. Now, you might say, why are you doing that? That's a threat, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's your perception, but I don't perceive it that way. The other country might say. And so we get into this gamesmanship issue. But here's the thing. Until something happens, nothing has happened. The question then becomes what instruments are effective in changing what you believe to be Russia's objectives, or shaping Russian objectives into the ones that you would want for them. A tough discussion. We don't have a lot of obvious solutions, or ones that even people sitting around the table who are experts on the military or on economic sanctions or on any sort of form of international pressure would all agree on. I can tell you, having studied the literature on sanctions, that it's very murky, and most people come to the conclusion that it is not effective. And especially in countries in this condition, large countries, self-sufficient countries, countries that have a lot at stake at the issue, the likelihood of them changing their objectives because of the threat of potential sanctions, economic sanctions of any kind, if the issue is truly of vital importance to them, is zero. There's not been a single example of success. So, and frankly, throwing 8,000 troops to a neighboring country, to the border, or not even putting them, I think they're there, but on heightened alert. Well, I don't know what that does. That just does nothing. I think the key is understanding Russian motivations properly. And I don't think those motivations are to invade. And the reason is I see no advantage to engaging or being in a civil war. So you know, and there was one thing, so Russia has stipulated over the past few weeks 2 criteria for which would lead it to intervene. One is if there is a blitzkrieg, Ukrainian blitzkrieg against the East. This in the Ukrainian press, this is called the Croatian scenario, where they occupy the territory in a couple of days, a week or so, and they do it so quickly, and Russia's then faced with a fait accompli. And Russia says, we're positioning our troops to prevent that from happening. That was the argument in February 21, and it's the argument today. Frankly, I forget what the second criteria is, but it's something related to that. There is never been a suggestion on the Russian side of any interest in occupying more of Ukraine. And the reason is pretty obvious, because that's when prolonged guerrilla fighting begins. And why does Russia need that? It just doesn't. It's not a matter of Western pressure. It just doesn't need that. Now, one of the most well-connected, I'll just end on this note, one of the most well-connected Russian analysts, Sergei Karaganov, wrote recently on a comment, social media comment. He said, we won't do the US that favor. That would be the worst thing. The United States might want to give us a Ukraine, which, whose industry is destroyed, whose population is impoverished, all these things. And why in the world would we ever want to accept that gift now? With all the investment that we would have to do just to bring it up to speed. We learned that lesson in Crimea. Look how much money we've been spending there just to bring it up, to Russia's economic standards. Mm. So nobody's talking in those terms except, I guess, in the White House.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this has been going on now for 3 months.
And I kind of wonder, I know this is a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
But what happens if they don't invade?
Right.
What's our strategy then? Do we go, oops, or never mind, or wait a second, you keep deferring the invasion, maybe, instead of the next 3 months, it'll be the next 3 years. And when do analysts begin to look silly just saying that? And I'm not talking about analysts. Analysts will probably know better. But like White House spokesmen and people on television going, well, now. There's consequences in terms of the belief and credibility. And you know where those consequences will hit first is NATO. People are not talking about this enough. The president of Croatia yesterday, the day before, said, hey, you know what? If there is a conflict, we will pull our NATO troop forces back. Okay, we're out of there. We're bringing them all home. They won't be the only ones.
It's been 3 months. I mean, so much for the element of surprise, right? So we'll see what happens, but it's
you can never say never. I mean, right? It's foolish to say never.
Right.
But the criteria that Russia has mentioned are very narrow and very specific, and they've kept warning the Ukrainians not to push into an offensive, not to launch an offense in the east. So if that doesn't happen, I think the likelihood of a Russian military intervention, which would be obvious and recognized as such rather than some covert thing that we can debate for years, is close to nil.
Okay, there's a couple more. Chloe follows up with, you're referring to some strategic documents on Russia's willingness to support its speakers in the near abroad following the collapse of the USSR. Can you be more specific on that?
Oh, yeah, I did a study for a presentation for the U.S. Army on the strategic doctrines. So I read them all. There's a statement, just to bring it all to the present, there's a statement by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, recently that stipulated criteria that, let's see here. Yeah, I'm not going to find it right away here, but that's stipulated that it would, and Putin said this, has said this before, they will not accept the imposition of the Ukrainian government's authority by military force in the Donbass, in the uncontrolled Ukrainian territories of Donbass. You should be able to find that just by Googling.
Yeah, Chloe, thanks for the question. And finally, Juan asks, what is your opinion that right-wing media in the US adopting Russian-friendly messaging? Is this just criticizing Biden or some other motives?
Yeah, I don't really follow or compare American media coverage to the media coverage that I follow, which is Ukrainian media coverage, because they're worlds apart and they have vastly different agendas. I do suspect that if you're referring to Fox News, that the agenda there is to mock and discredit the current administration, and anything will do. So any political gaffe made by the current administration will be food for amusement. But again, that has nothing or very little to actually do with the heart of the controversy, which I believe lies within Ukraine, not in the debate over what to do about Ukraine by foreign powers.
Thank you for that. And I think we're coming back to the end of our time today, and Dr. Petro, thank you very much for these very erudite and thoughtful remarks on this. I think, it gives us a little more perspective on what's going on. I look forward to your book coming out. I think it'll be very interesting to read it. We hope that we'll have you back to talk more about this, and as we continue in our journey here and try to understand this region better.
Thanks, Mike. The questions were very good. Were these your students mostly, you think?
We have students, we have professors, we have interested public, and I think we're really pleased that everybody can join us today. Thank you very much for your attentiveness and excellent questions, and we look forward to seeing you again for our next program. Next month, we have a roundtable discussion which will be February 16th, and I think, Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, February 16th, about the same time, which will be a roundtable with our faculty members on cybersecurity and intelligence analysis. So look out for the invitations for that. And as for me, I'm signing off. Thank you again, Nick Petro. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.